Hello. So since we managed to spin up our cluster of our 3 master nodes using k3s, we can now basically look at how to throw some very simple configurations at it. And the easiest way to start is to basically create a deployment and a service. So usually you have your ingress, and from the ingress, traffic goes to the service, and from the service, it goes to the pods and reaches the containers. We will have an example here where we define a deployment, and as part of that deployment, we define the replica set. So basically how many pods will be running. Then we define our pod with the containers inside. As an example, we are going to use Nginx because Nginx is rather easy. So you can just spin it up and query it, and you will get a response for testing. So what we have is basically 2 YAML files. The first is for Nginx deployment. So we have the kind deployment. Then we specify some metadata, like give it a name and give it a label. And then we come to the spec section, which is the actual definition of what the pod will be running. So in here we have a replicas of 1. That means that we are going to run 1 replication of this pod, and we are also giving it a name. So we basically pick the name here that we picked above here, and we're also going to specify it here. If you always follow this method, you will have no problems finding the logs of your application, stuff like that later on. Okay, so inside the spec, we then have another spec which then specifies our pods and our containers. So inside here, we have one Nginx container, and that container exposes port 80. And then we also specify resource limits. So that was one of the biggest issues I had when container technology started. One container has some issue and then starts consuming resources, and that then causes all the other containers on the same host to have issues and timeouts. And that's what you really want to avoid. So I would recommend you to always start defining resources. I personally use Visual Studio Code. And if I can find the marketplace, where is it? Yeah, the extensions. And you use for Kubernetes, you will find this main plugin, which allows you to have some integration to manage your Kubernetes cluster. And we also have this YAML plugin, which I recommend you to install. And once you have that installed, you have to go to the extension settings. And then you can edit your settings.json. And in here, you have to specify this little block. So that basically tells your IDE, so in this case, Visual Studio Code, to validate YAML files after the Kubernetes syntax. And if you have that going and you are, for example, missing your resources, then it will give you some yellow lines which tell you to take a look that something isn't as ideal as it should be. And here it says 1 or more containers do not have resource limits. This could stuff other processes. So we are basically going to add them back in, and remember from now on, whenever we define a deployment or a pod, we always add some resource limits, because that will decrease your issues in the long run. Okay, then we have a second file. As I've previously explained, traffic usually comes in through the ingress, then goes to a service, and then is being redirected to the actual containers. And in here, we define our service. Again, we are giving it a name called Nginx, and we use the same app selector that we did for the deployment. And here we then specify the target port, and the target port is basically the container port that we exposed here. So then the service knows it can talk to the container on port 80. And the service itself is exposing port 1337. And the type is a load balancer. Okay, so the next step would be to simply apply the config. So I am first going to apply the deployment. Oh, there is a small typo in here. Hold on. Probably, yeah, version 1. Okay, so again, we apply the configuration, and which is already nice. We've seen, like, if we have some syntax errors in our configuration, it would tell us and give us some information of what is wrong. So here it told us that version 1e didn't exist because it's version 1. And now that we have applied the configuration, we can take a look at kube control get pods. So as I've said earlier, we didn't, I think I didn't say that, no. We didn't specify any namespaces, so it's now going to basically go into the default namespace. And here is our container. And we can use kube control describe pod and then the pod name to basically get a description. That is like the readable format, but you can also specify -o YAML. Oh no, then you don't have to describe, but then you have to get the configuration in YAML format. So that basically returns you a configuration that includes what you have basically defined at the beginning, but it also includes a status. So it basically, the cluster knows the status of this application and it stores information in etcd. And by using this, you can basically retrieve that information. If you want to edit a pod, you can also go to kube control edit pod. Now we don't need the -o YAML anymore because we don't want to output that in YAML. But this is basically how you could just edit it on the fly. So you see it creates a bunch of random information, but we still have the underlying information that we initially specified. So for example, if we want to edit our limits, we could just do that here. Then we save the file by using Control X, save, and then it will automatically reload. Oh yeah, of course. We wouldn't want to edit the pod, but we would want to edit our deployments to change things. So we would do kube control, edit, deployment, and then give it the name. And I think now we can go down and, for example, increase our limits. So that now basically changed the pod. And if we do that, you can now see it's terminating the old pod and spinning up a new pod with the new limits that we set. So you can see that now the CPU limits are raised to 200, and we earlier had 100. So basically, you can use that, or what you could also do is go into your Nginx Deployment YAML, and then go to the section that you want to edit. So we had 100 here, so now we are going to change it to 300. And then we would just run our kube control apply Nginx Deployment. And again, it would see if there are any changes, and it says configured. So it means that it did some changes. So if we run our kube control get pods again, you can see that 9 seconds ago, it again started. So after we applied these changes, it then also terminated the old and created a new one. And now let's run a kube control describe pod again. And this time we can see that it's set to 300. So this is a rather easy way to interact with it. Yeah, what you also can do is you can manually start to roll out a change for your deployment. So if you do kube control get deployments, it would list us our current deployments that are running. So we now have a uptime of 4 minutes, but we can do kube control rollout restart deployment and give it the name, which is Nginx Deployment. So then you will see it will again create a new container. And once that new container has been created, it will shut down the old container, which was running previously, spins up a new one, and then the new one keeps on running. So this is how you would basically update stuff. There are different ways of updating. We'll get more into details on these later on. What I want to do now is show how we can scale up to more instances. So right now we have a replicas definition of 1, and we can change that, for example, to 3. Save the file, and then run our kube control, apply -f Nginx deployment. And now we basically told the cluster our desired state is 3, and the cluster in turn then will spin up 3 new containers. Okay, so now the second part would be to apply our configuration for the service. So there we specify kube control, apply -f Nginx service, and now it created the service. And you can type kube control get service, or you can also use the short version called SVC. And now you can see where this external IP comes in handy. So now basically the services is exposed on the cluster IP, which is like the internal network that k3s uses, but it's also exposed on a external IP. So if we use other stuff like external DNS, we can, for example, send API calls to Cloudflare to create DNS records. And then we can pass on this external IP of the service to be created. That way we don't really have to use a managed load balancer, and managed load balancers are really expensive in most cloud environments. That's another hacky way to get the costs down a little bit. Okay, so now that we have created it and have our 3 clients up and running, or 3 pods up and running, since we now created a cluster, basically we have one service scheduled on each of the containers that are running the nodes. So if we go to pods wide, we can see it's running on each of the nodes. We have one of these Nginx containers running. And then on each of the nodes where one of these Nginx containers is running, it's also starting up a service. So we can basically query the nodes 1, 2, or 3, and then we will get a response from the service, which then routes the traffic to the actual containers or pods. Last but not least, we are going to take a look inside the Nginx deployment, and we now change the replicas back down to 1, apply our configuration, and then we can watch how our pods are being terminated. You can see that it's still running the 3 services. So we basically, since we specified to use the load balancer in our previous definition, it now basically creates a service on each of the nodes. So it basically creates one service, but each service then has 3 pods running for this service on each of the 3 nodes. So that way, no matter which of the actual k3s nodes you are querying, it will always redirect the traffic to the pod in question, where we are currently running one replica. So now that we've done that, we can go back to our Nginx deployment, and we change the replicas back to 1, or let's change it to 2. And then we can run a kube control, apply -f again on the Nginx deployment. And we check one last time to get our pods. And now we have 2 pods and the 3 services. So I hope this gives a little bit of introduction on how to apply configuration, how to use services, deployment, how to scale up or down, and how to update your deployments.